All right, folks. Well, we are continuing with our discussion of moral skepticism. Uh, and this time around, we're going to be looking at a well known theory called moral relativism. So, sometimes also referred to as ethical relativism. Uh, there's no important difference between the word moral and ethical in this context. So, here's what you think if you are an ethical relativist. Your idea is that there are no objective moral standards. So the thought here is that if you're a moral relativist, you think that there are no moral rules that apply to everybody all the time. In more specific and technical terms, we're going to say that an objective moral standard is a standard that applies to everyone, whether or not they think that standard applies to them. So, you might think about somebody who's really strong in their moral beliefs, and these people might say, something like rape or maybe abortion is something that's wrong no matter what. It's wrong no matter which culture you're in. And it's wrong no matter what your personal beliefs are. So that's going to be somebody who believes in objective moral standards. So in opposition to this idea that there are objective moral standards, the moral relativist says moral standards are correct only relative to each society that we're considering. So the thought would be, there might be some practices that are right for my society, but not right for your society. And that's the way in which these standards are not objective, because they're not standards that apply to everybody. So we can think about examples here, right? We could think about how in some cultures, for instance, there's been anthropological data that suggests that, for instance, certain Inuit cultures will basically allow the most elderly people within that culture to die, basically by leaving them behind during a hunt. And this is sort of a common example, right? We might also think about people talking about sort of very controversial issues like female circumcision. Well, the person who believes in objective moral standards is going to say that female circumcision is wrong all the time, no matter what. Whereas the relativist is going to say, well, it's wrong for our culture for sure, but we should be tolerant of cultures who practice that, because relative to that culture, we can say that that is an acceptable and ordinary practice. So, we can see that within this context, so what does the moral relativist really think? Well, they're basically saying that an act is morally acceptable just because it is allowed by the guiding ideals of the society in which it's performed, and it's morally wrong just because it's the kind of action that the ideals of that culture forbids. So many people are really attracted to this idea of ethical relativism. So let's run through some of the reasons why we might be attracted to moral relativism, as identified by Schaefer-Landau in the textbook. So one thing is that it explains why morality is special to humans. So the thought here is that morality is a thing that is created by and practiced by people, right? There aren't moral standards that apply to natural disasters there aren't moral standards that apply to animals. And the reason why is that morality is a thing that people make, and that the standards of morality only apply to people. So, we don't judge wolves as morally bad for killing their prey. We don't judge hurricanes to be bad for killing people. It's sad, but there's no moral blame there, right? So the thought is like, look, morality is a thing that exists because humans exist. When human beings stop existing in this universe, well, at that point, morality will no longer exist. It seems like the moral relativist has an easier time explaining this than somebody who believes in objective moral standards. There's the thought that moral relativism is scientifically respectable because all that it posits, all that it believes in, really, is standards practiced by people in a particular time. And it's not referring to any objective moral standards that are eternal and unchanged by human psychology, like this concept of critical morality that we looked at in the first week of this class. We can say that if you're an ethical relativist, that's going to explain the possibility of how we acquire moral knowledge. Do you want to know what the right thing to do is? Well, you should figure out what the guiding ideals of your culture happen to be. And when you know the guiding ideals of your culture, then that's all you need to know what the morally right thing to do is. So if I'm deciding whether I need to give more money to charity, or if I'm deciding whether to keep a promise to a friend, well, if I want to know what the right thing to do is, I just have to figure out what my culture expects of me on the basis of its guiding ideals. You might say that moral relativism is, in an important way, egalitarian, right? Because it says that everybody, or at least every culture, is as good a judge of morality as anybody else. So nobody's like the king of morality. Nobody is allowed to impose their will about the right or wrong thing to do on other persons. Now, here's an alleged advantage of moral relativism, and it's the idea that you should be a moral relativist. You should say, well, some things are right for me, but they might not be right for you, and some things are wrong for me, but they're not wrong for you. You might think that if you value tolerance, if you want to be a tolerant person, you'd better be a moral relativist. But this may well not make sense. And here's one reason why, or one thing that you should notice if you want to adopt an approach to morality that values tolerance. We might notice that if you really value tolerance, you should notice that at least on some versions of moral relativism, you're going to have to permit intolerance, and you might even be sometimes required to be intolerant. So for instance, if we went back 200 years to a phase in American history where slavery and racism was, part of the cultural ethos, then we might say that those practices and the sorts of intolerance that come along with them are actually what you have to do, and that those things are perfectly okay. So a lot of people appeal to tolerance as a reason to be an ethical relativist. But if you value tolerance no matter where you can find it, uh, that's actually an objective moral standard and a reason to reject ethical relativism. Now, there are some appealing things about the theory. There's also big problems with being an ethical relativist. So let's run through those. What we might say is that if you adopt ethical relativism, the view that the correctness of your moral beliefs is relative to the guiding ideals of whatever culture you happen to be in, well then, we're going to say, well, if ethical truth is in fact determined by cultural ideals, then it's impossible for a culture's ideals to ever be mistaken, right? But just think about this example of slavery and segregation in America. If we're saying that, one culture's ideals makes it impermissible to enslave people, like it is in our contemporary culture, but if cultural ideals permitted it or required it 200 years ago, then we're just going to say, well, neither culture is ever mistaken. And that seems pretty implausible to many people. Right? And we might also say, if ethical relativism is true, then the moral views of all cultures are equally good. Right? So we can think about the society that permits female circumcision. We can think about the society that forbids it. We might say, well, whatever you happen to require by your guiding ideals, both of you are equally right. If ethical relativism is true, then moral progress is impossible. Moral views can change, but they cannot improve. The thought here being, look, our guiding ideals in America used to permit or even require intolerance. Now we require tolerance, right? But neither approach is better than the other. They're just different. Well, many of you probably think that America is a better place than it was 200 years ago. And if you think that, then it seems that you think that our guiding ideals have improved, which tells against ethical relativism. Here's an interesting one. It says that if ethical relativism is true, then an iconoclast, that is, a person who is opposed to conventional moral wisdom, is going to be always mistaken. So the idea here is that somebody like Martin Luther King or Socrates, insofar as these people were telling their societies that we need to rethink what we value, well, not only are they making a mistake because they're not recognizing that, according to relativism, whatever a society thinks is automatically right, it's actually saying that somebody who is fighting against what society is doing is automatically, and just as a matter of conceptual truth, always going to be wrong. Here's the last one. If ethical relativism is true, it would be really hard to make sense of a moral disagreement. Now, what does that mean? Well, we can think about how, our culture might, permit certain practices like women driving cars, whereas other cultures have forbidden it, right? Now, if you're a moral relativism, basically what we're saying is, for me, women driving is okay, and for you, women driving is not okay. And if we take that approach, then we're just saying that, like, look, it's true for me, and that opposing view is true for you, but they're just different views. Neither is better. But it seems like people disagree with people from other cultures quite often about what the best practice is. So for instance, I might meet somebody from a culture who says that women driving cars is not a good thing. And I might say back to them, but I think it is a good thing. And it seems like in that moment, we're saying that there is a fact of the matter about whether women should be allowed to drive, and we're genuinely disagreeing about it. But if ethical relativism is true, then it's basically saying, well, that is right for me and my culture to let women drive. It's wrong for you and your culture to let women drive, but there's no fundamentally right answer, right? It might be like saying, like, to me, putting pineapple on pizza is gross, and maybe for somebody else, it's delicious, and that's all there is to it. So we might think that there are genuine disagreements about what's morally right and wrong, and if we take that thought seriously, then it seems like ethical relativism is going to have a hard time explaining the genuineness of those disagreements. Now we can just notice, with all of these strange implications of ethical relativism, these are all phrased in the form of conditionals, right? If we have relativism, then we would have to say it's impossible for a culture's ideals to be mistaken. All of them are equally good. You can have change, but not improvement. Iconoclasts are always morally mistaken. And there's no way of making sense of ethical disagreement. But what we can notice here is that because we've got conditionals, and these are strange implications, we can use these to construct a modus tollens argument against ethical relativism. So you'll remember that last week we learned that a modus tollens argument is a certain kind of valid argument, an argument where if both of the premises are true, then the conclusion will have to be true. So remember, a modus tollens argument goes, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? So we can actually look at this. So here's one possible counter argument based on these problems that we just looked at. So we say, if ethical truth is determined by our cultural ideals, then it's impossible for a culture's ideals to ever be mistaken. So we've got an if-then sentence, right? And then we might say, it is possible for a culture's ideals to be mistaken. And you can pick out your favorite example of some particular culture getting things wrong, right? So you might think about, for instance, slavery and segregation as it existed in American history. We could even look at our own culture, right? So certainly racism is not a problem that has been completely fixed in America, and we might think that this goes right down to some of the problematic ideals at the core of American life and culture, right? But if you can give me a clear example of a culture with ideals that are mistaken, then that's going to be good justification for premise 2, right? So this premise says, if P then Q, so if you're a moral relativist, then it's impossible for a culture's ideals to be mistaken. A really good way to show that something is possible is to show that it's actual, right? So I can give you an actual instance of a culture with mistaken ideals, and then we can conclude in the form of modus ponens, if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? We get the conclusion, so ethical truth is not determined by cultural ideals. And maybe just to go a little further, we could add another premise that just by understanding definitions of concepts, we can infer 4 from 3, right? Because ethical relativism just is the view that for a moral belief to be true is just for it to be permitted by a culture's ideals. So that's one possible counter-argument against ethical relativism. Now, if we go back to the strange implications, we could construct a similar kind of modus tollens argument using any of these other strange implications. So I'll leave it to you to think about whether this argument is sort of a knockdown, devastating argument against ethical relativism, or whether you think that the moral relativist might have some kind of response to give back to this objection to their view. So just to wrap up, I want to talk about one other discussion of ethical relativism that shows up in our readings for this week. And it's a short little essay by the British philosopher Mary Midgely, who died at the ripe old age of 98 or 99 just a couple of years ago. So Midgely is arguing against a view that's very close to moral relativism. We might think of moral isolationism as like a specific way of being a moral relativist. So here's the official view. Moral isolationists believe that we are unable to adequately understand other cultures, and because of this fact, we should suspend judgment about the merits or flaws of those cultures. So the thought is, we can't really understand the motives or the reasoning behind, say, cultures that forbid women from driving, or that practice female circumcision, or perhaps we might think of Inuit cultures, for instance, that basically practice systematic euthanasia on elder members of their cultures. So the moral isolationist thinks that we should not judge other cultures, and for a specific reason, according to the moral isolationist. So the isolationist thinks that we can't judge other cultures because we can't adequately understand them, right? So Midgely is going to argue against that view. So we've already talked about tolerance today, but they might say that the only way to show tolerance and respect for other cultures is to take this sort of isolationist stance, to let everybody do their own thing, to say that we can't understand them, so we shouldn't judge them. And Midgely gives a really interesting example, and a historical example, which is an ancient samurai practice that used to be practiced in Japan called sujiguri. So the idea with sujiguri is the idea that when a samurai gets a new sword, they have to make sure that it works properly. And in order to make sure that it works properly, they need to know that it can cut a person in half. If they failed to cut a person in half during battle, then that would bring great dishonor to their families. So what they would do is they would find a stranger, basically like a wayfarer, right? And these samurai would take their brand new swords, they would try them out, they would cut this person in half. And I believe that if you look at exactly what Midgely says in the book, she says that these wayfarers are cut from flank to flank. So that's basically they would cut the person through the arm, through the chest, and through the other arm, right? Now Midgely says, when we think about this example, most people, especially if you're not a moral isolationist, would say, it seems like what this culture was doing in this practice was the wrong thing to do. But the isolationists might hesitate to criticize this practice. So the isolationist might say, well, we don't fully understand maybe samurai concepts of honor, and we might not understand the importance of this practice to their traditions. Um, so, what are we to make of this debate? We've got the isolationist on the one hand saying that we should never judge other cultures and that it's basically impossible to understand them. Midgely is against this view. Well, what's her objection going to be? Well, basically, she has some questions for the moral isolationist. So here are her questions. So the thought is that there's supposed to be, according to the isolationist, an isolating barrier between cultures. This barrier makes it impossible for them to understand us and for us to understand them. Does that isolating barrier work both ways? Are other cultures not entitled to judge us in the same way that we're not entitled to judge them? So that's like the first question that she seems to raise. The second one is, does that mean that we can't praise the perspectives and practices of other cultures? And the third is, if we can't judge other cultures when we don't understand them, can we really judge our own? So these are the sorts of questions that philosophers raise. And questions in and of themselves aren't objections. Here's a little tip for writing philosophy. Don't ever raise a rhetorical question and leave it unanswered. Right? It's great to raise a question, but then it's also good to talk about ways that we could go in answering these questions and say what makes the most sense to us. So here's what we might notice in one place. Midgely says that it seems like when we talk about an isolating barrier between cultures, Midgely notes that anthropologists don't seem to consistently follow this rule of not permitting cross-cultural judgments. So she tells a story about an Amazonian indigenous person who then goes into the city to receive special medical treatment. And during the stay, this Amazonian indigenous person raised many complaints about the way things were done in contemporary Brazilian society. And the anthropologist said, it seems like this indigenous person offered a damning critique of Western society. Right? Well, isn't that weird that an indigenous person who spends 2 weeks in the city is able to understand the culture and its practices well enough to criticize them, but apparently we're not supposed to criticize people the other way around. Now, this argument might seem a bit like an ad hominem argument. Basically, we shouldn't believe moral isolationism because the anthropologists who advocate for it are inconsistent and don't actually practice it. I think that in that sort of frame, that might be an ad hominem argument, one of our argumentative fallacies. But we might, to defend Midgely a little bit, we might say that what she seems to be saying here is that the main claim of moral isolationism is so implausible that even the people who want to follow it can't consistently follow it. Similarly, when she says, don't we praise the perspectives and practices of other cultures? She points out that praising other cultures is something that we frequently do, right? So we might consider how other cultures, say, give more concern and consideration and political power to women. And that might seem to be something that we admire. Well, Midgely says, we do that kind of thing. Many isolationists do it as well. And this suggests that we do understand those other cultures. And we can note, understanding a culture and praising it doesn't mean that we have to understand every single part of that culture. Understanding of another culture might be a graded, partial kind of thing, and we might think that within that context, understanding is something that's possible, not something that's impossible, like the original statement of moral isolationism suggested. Thirdly, she asks, if we can't understand other cultures, then that bans us from judging them. Can we really judge our own? Well, Midgely says there are things that we don't understand in our own culture. You might think about how people of a certain generation, people say like boomers born in the 40s and 50s, sometimes have a hard time understanding things like rights for transgender people. But that doesn't understand, some boomers from trying to understand these new emerging norms better. And also, there is genuine cross-cultural conversation between different generations of our society, between, boomers like my parents, millennials like me, and, Generation Z folks like many of you, my students, are. So there does seem to be actual work that's being done where we can actually put the work in, try to understand a different culture better. And Midgely says oftentimes when we say that we shouldn't outrightly condemn another culture, like the samurais who practice sujiguri, oftentimes what defenders of these practices will do is they'll say, well, it seems like there are certain justifications for why this samurai practice might exist. And in that sense, we're actually trying to understand better what's going on in that culture in order to actually find something admirable in it, which is quite different from this isolationist view, which suggests that we just have no opportunities to make judgments about these other cultures because it's completely impossible to understand them. So that's sort of a specific instance of a discussion about relativism. So that's going to wrap it up for this discussion. So the big takeaways. Moral relativism or ethical relativism is a view that's commonplace, and many people find this view very appealing. But I think that we should also notice that there are serious philosophical difficulties with the view also, relating to this idea that if the right answer in morality is just what a culture thinks, it seems like it's going to be hard to think of things like one culture having it more right than another culture. And it seems like some of our justification, like tolerance or impossibility of understanding, might not be as strong justifications for moral relativism as some of its advocates would suggest. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening, and get in touch if you have any questions or concerns.